This is the new 2021 BMW M440i, and let's just get it out of the way. It has a big grille. A large, rather oversized, in fact, very expressive grille. But there is more to this car than just the grille. So today, I'm going to review the new M440i and show you the grille and everything else. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new online enthusiast car auction website for modern cool cars. Anything cool from the 1980s and up is on Cars and Bids. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool car from that era, check out Cars and Bids. And now you can find your dream Cars and Bids listing on Autotempest.com. Thanks to a new partnership we have, Autotempest, you can find all the cars in one place, including Cars and Bids. Check it out, carsandbids.com. I've borrowed this M440i from CREVIER BMW here in Orange County in Southern California, the largest BMW dealership in North America. CREVIER BMW sells more than anyone else, and they have all of the latest BMW models, the new X7, the X5M, and the M440i, this car, which has just started to arrive in dealerships nationwide. So let's talk M440i. This is the flagship model in the new BMW 4 Series lineup, at least for now, until the new BMW M4 goes on sale sometime this spring. Like in the past, BMW is offering the new 4 Series in two versions. There's a base model, which they call the 430i, that has about 255 horsepower, and then there's this, the sportier, higher performance upgrade version, which they call the M440i. And on paper, it's pretty compelling. Like the M340i, which is essentially the sedan version of this car, the M440 has 382 horsepower, which is a pretty big number, and it'll do 0 to 60 in about 4.3 seconds, which is pretty quick. Now, a base level 430i starts around $46,000, but if you step up to the M440, it's just under $60,000, and that's before options. And with this car, you also have a grille. A large, very distinctive, very expressive grille that has been very controversial and the subject of a lot of debate both online and elsewhere. And today we're going to talk about it and the rest of the car too. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the new M440i and show you all of the interesting quirks and features of the latest BMW Coupe. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the new M440i with probably its biggest quirk, and that would be the grille. The massive grille that has inspired so much controversy about these cars. And I have to say, it's ugly. I often defend new cars. Oh, you'll get used to it. I'll give it time. Not in this case. Now, I have defended this grille in other BMW models. In the X7, I think it looks okay. A big vehicle needs a big grille. It makes sense. It even looks fine in the new 7 Series, but here, it's just so much, so cartoonishly large, and frankly, so unnecessary. I don't know why they felt they had to make this grille so large, so massive, so over-emphatic as they did here. It just looks weird. BMW's grills used to be called kidney grills. Well, now these are like lung grills. They've grown so dramatically. Now, two things worth mentioning about the grille. One, the fact that this car is black actually hides a lot of the ugliness of this grille, in my opinion. That's a good thing to know. If you're thinking about getting one of these or ordering an M4, getting a black car, you can see it kind of hides just the sheer giganticness of this grille. Lighter colors or brighter colors, the grille really stands out more, and black hides it a little bit better. So one way to kind of minimize the visual impact of the grille still get a black car. It's still big, but it doesn't quite look as big. It won't shock bystanders quite as much. The other thing I want to point out with this grille, the whole thing kind of makes me sad because BMW is in a renaissance phase for their car designs. They are coming up with some of the most beautiful BMWs since the late 90s. The current 5 Series looks better than any 5 Series since the E39 back in the late 90s. The current X5 is the best looking one since the original. The 8 Series, this car, they're all really nice. A lot of great designs coming out of BMW, and yet they screw it up with this giant oversized front grille that's all anybody looks at. If you look at the rest of this car, from basically the grille back, you'll see a pretty beautiful, subtle, not overstyled, well-designed coupe. But then you look up here and you think, well, forget all that stuff. This looks ridiculous. And it does, and it's such a shame. And next up, we move on to entering the new M440i. The lights don't do some cool dance when you approach, but they do fade in, which looks nice. You can see in the back, the brake lights sort of fade on when you unlock the doors. Same deal in front. The headlights kind of fade to let you know that, yes, you're approaching, and now you can climb into your M440. Before I climb in, I do want to mention there are quite a few M badges throughout this car. Even though this isn't a true M vehicle like an M4, they're really trying to tie it to the M performance division. You have one on the back where it says M440i, of course. You also have M colors on the key, which is a little surprising. Again, not an M car, but you can show people, yeah, you see, I got my M with your M colors. It also says M performance on the engine cover under the hood, again, emphasizing your M-ness. And when you open the door, you have an M badge on the door sill. Now, again, this is not a true M car, but they really want to make that close connection so people feel like they're getting some of the M treatment, even if they're not spending money to get a real M4. And next up, we move inside the M440. A few important things to point out here. For one thing, the gear lever in the middle, automatic transmission. There is no manual transmission option for this car, at least right now, and probably not at all. You only get an automatic. It's the only transmission available. This will make some purists sad, but it's the reality in more and more new cars, even sporty ones. Now, this gear lever does have an interesting function. If you're driving along, you have it in drive, and you put it over into manual mode, you can see it's now sort of tilted to the left, and you can use the gear lever to upshift and downshift. If you want to put the car in park and you're in manual mode, you can see it automatically moves back over out of manual mode to go into park. This is an odd thing. It moves without you actually moving it. There's some motor in there that brings it back to the center, so you can't actually park the car in manual mode. Every time you try, there's a little transmission lever ghost that moves the lever. And speaking of things that move in here, when you get in, there is a seatbelt delivery system. You climb inside, sit down, close the door, and this little arm extends out to give you your seatbelt. Then you put your seatbelt on, and the little arm retracts back into its home. That's because this is a relatively large two-door car, and reaching back to get the seatbelt can be kind of cumbersome. So having the little delivery system makes it easier to reach your seatbelt when you climb in. The reason it's not always extended is because that would make it more difficult for passengers to get into the back seat. So instead, it extends and retracts depending on your circumstances when you climb in the car. That's kind of a cool touch. And next we move on to the rest of this interior. It's nice in here, but there are some materials that are lacking a little bit compared to higher end BMW models. That's no surprise really, but I just reviewed the X5M, and you can tell where this car is kind of decontented and a little cheaper. For example, around the gear lever, it's a lot of plastic buttons, whereas in the X5M, you had some gloss black. Everything looked nicer there. Same deal on the dashboard. You have this kind of vinyl plastic looking surface, not exactly the nicest stuff. And higher end BMW models will have nicer materials here and on the lower half of the dashboard as well. But this car at this price point, apparently, it's just not quite expensive enough to get there, even though the sticker price of this M440 is about $66,000. With that said, I must say I do like this trim in the center console area, this sort of silvery textured trim around the gear lever, on the cup holder lid, and over on the passenger side of the dashboard. dashboard. A lot of people complain that piano black trim picks up fingerprints too easily, so this is a nice solution. Doesn't pick up fingerprints, still looks nice, and I like to see it in here. It really does look good. And next up we move on to the infotainment system in this car. The center screen, which is rather small compared to rivals. A lot of automakers are going for huge, ever increasingly larger screens, but this brand new BMW has a pretty small one, not that much bigger than a large smartphone, but very responsive, very easy to use, very intuitive, like in all modern BMWs. I've reviewed this system in various different vehicles, and I find it to be excellent. Now, I will say there is a little bit of a drawback to navigation destination entry. If you go to the navigation system to try to enter a destination, you can use the little pad on top of this wheel in the center console to write your destination out. Now, I've shown you in Audi models, you can write full words like a city or a street name, but BMW, you have to go letter by letter. You write a letter, it shows it on the screen, you write the next one, it shows it on the screen. It just takes longer, it's more cumbersome, and you can see what happens when I actually attempt to write a full word. It's just this jarbled jumble. It doesn't accept a full word. That is one benefit that other automakers have, and particularly Audi, who has advanced beyond BMW in terms of screen technology, both in the center and elsewhere. With that said, there is some good news regarding navigation destination entry. On the right side of the destination entry screen, there is a list entitled Points of Interest that you can select from, which will make it easier to find what you're looking for, and you don't have to enter a street name or an address. Now, the first point of interest, the default, is ice cream. I'm not sure why it's not like bank or gas station or grocery store. No, it's ice cream. So if you have an M440i and you really want to go find some ice cream, you will easily be able to locate it using the default first position in your points of interest in your navigation system. You want to find a grocery store? Well, then you'll have to scroll a little bit. Next up, here's another interesting quirk of the infotainment system. There's a setting you can configure that allows you to select if there is a passenger on board. And if there is, then when you have an incoming call or text message, it will not show the name of the caller or read a preview of the text message. This way, you're sitting in the car with someone, you don't necessarily want them to see that you're communicating with someone else. You get where I'm going with this. You can silence those communications, and it will just tell you a call is coming in, and it won't tell you from who. That's an interesting setting. And next up, we move on to the other big screen in this interior. That would be the one in the gauge cluster, which is very large. Unfortunately, not quite as configurable as rival models. Mercedes-Benz and Audi both offer more configurability, customizability in this gauge screen. BMW's is pretty stuck in its place, considering it's a screen that could be configured more. It's a little disappointing. For instance, this is as big as the map can get in your BMW gauge cluster screen, whereas Audi, Mercedes, and other brands, you can go full screen. It's just not quite as customizable as other brands that you might want. With that said, there is a cool quirk to this infotainment system, and that would be the changes it makes when you go through the different drive modes. You can see I'm doing that now, and the colors are changing, which in itself is kind of a cool look, but I especially like what happens over on the right half of the screen. The left half always stays your speedometer, but the right half changes. If you're in sport mode, it will show your tachometer, as you might expect. You go into comfort mode and it shows you a dial letting you know how much power you are currently using or how much you have left. If you go into Eco Pro, that's your most efficient drive mode, it will show you a constant fuel economy gauge that's always updating as you drive along. So your gauge over on the right depends on which drive mode you're in, letting you know the most important information, at least in BMW's mind, in that drive mode. And next we move on to the back seat in the M440i, and there are some surprisingly interesting drawbacks and benefits to the back seat in this car. The drawbacks both relate to getting in, no surprise. For one thing, moving the front seat forward is a bit of a chore. You have to reach in, pull this lever, and then just wait while the front seat powers itself forward, which takes longer than in basically every other car with this setup. Usually there's one latch that can just throw it forward. But once it's in this position, you can climb in, which again is a bit of a drawback because it's tight back here, although not as tight as some cars, still not exactly a place you would want adults to spend time. However, once you get back here, you'll discover a surprising amount of amenities. This car doesn't just have climate vents for the back seats, it has a rear seat climate control system back here for the back of a coupe, which is really surprising. And it even has automatic climate control back here. You set a temperature and it will make that temperature temperature happen in the back seats. That really shocks me. This isn't like a Maybach, it's a BMW Coupe. The back seats will never be used, but you have that nice feature. You also have 2 USB-C ports back here. That's more than I see in some family SUVs. But in this car, 2 of them, so you can charge multiple devices at once for your back seat passengers. A big surprise how luxurious it is back here, even though it isn't exactly roomy. And next up, we move on to the back of the M440i, where there are a few things I want to highlight. One is the exhaust note, which is surprisingly muscular, at least in sport mode. Take a listen. Next up, a few other things worth noting around back. One, this badge here, X Drive, that means that this M440i has all-wheel drive. And right now, that's the only way you can get the M440i. There is no rear-wheel drive version. If you want rear-wheel drive, you have to get the base model, the 430i, which is offered with rear or all-wheel drive. I'm told a rear-wheel drive version of the M440i might be on the way in the future, but right now, at least, it's all-wheel drive only. One other item worth pointing out back here, the BMW badge in the center. You notice anything interesting about it? You look closely, there's a camera in it. Below the BMW Roundel logo, the backup camera is mounted there, very subtle. You wouldn't notice it if you're sitting behind this car in traffic, but it's a nice way to hide the backup camera in back and make it a little bit cleaner rather than having one sticking out looking kind of ugly and obvious. The drawback is if your badge fades or it gets hit and you have to go and replace it, suddenly a $23 BMW badge turns into a $741 part because it includes a camera inside of it. Nonetheless, it does look good, better than your typical camera stuck on the back of the car. And since I'm back here, let's talk trunk, although there's not really all that much to discuss. The trunk is fairly normal, fairly deep, not very wide, looks exactly like you'd expect in a back of a coupe like this. One item worth pointing out, there are releases for the rear seats in the trunk. You pull on this little tab, the back seat falls down, and that way you can stick larger items in here without having to go around and undo each rear seat and fold them from inside the car. It's a lot more convenient from the trunk. And finally, we move under the hood in the M440i. This is a turbocharged 6-cylinder. Like I mentioned, 382 horsepower, and it has about 360 pound-feet of torque, so it's muscular both in terms of power and torque. It seems like a good engine. It also has, like I mentioned before, an M Performance badge on the plastic engine cover, along with these 6 ridges, I guess to signify that it's a 6-cylinder engine, even though they don't really correspond to anything actually happening under the plastic cover. At least you get to see this is an M Performance 6-cylinder. Now, one interesting thing this car doesn't have is that usual BMW warning label letting you know not to work on your car if you're wearing a tie, because the tie could get caught in the fan and then you will be killed. Without that warning label, I don't understand. How are people supposed to know not to work on their cars while wearing ties? I think we need to bring back that label, BMW. Come on, very dangerous under here. And so those are the quirks and features of the new BMW M440i. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the M440i. I have to admit, looking around this car, there really are a lot of M logos. There's one on the steering wheel, there's one in the gauge cluster, but there's 2 in the gauge cluster, but there's not quite the same number of M stuff as a true M car. You don't have it on the headrests. You also don't have as much configurability in terms of drive modes as a real M car. So there are ways where they kind of dialed it back a little bit, but they're really trading on that M name, which makes sense. It has a lot of value. All right, well, first things first, this car does feel exceptionally quick. In fact, I'm surprised at how quick it feels, although I guess I shouldn't be. When I went and looked up the 0 to 60 time for this car, I was surprised to see it was only 3/10 behind the outgoing M4. So this isn't the M car technically, but at least in terms of acceleration, horsepower, it certainly feels very, very fast. And I have to say that's nice, because looking around this car before, I didn't really get the feeling that it was quite as special as you might want from, I don't know, a new $70,000 BMW. But I will say it definitely drives special. It has A lot more acceleration power than I was expecting. It feels quick, quite quick, properly, legitimately fast. It's also very smooth. The car is very smooth and luxurious if you want it to be. It doesn't have to be excessively fast. The shifts are smooth. That's an impressive component. It does have sort of a luxury coupe feel to it. And I have to say, I read some reviews of this car where a few reviewers were disappointed by the driving experience. They said the car has gotten too big, too heavy. I agree with that to an extent, but BMW has done a better job mitigating that than I was expecting based on those reviews. The car actually is more spry than I thought, not just from an acceleration perspective, but it also handles better than I was expecting it to, given what I had heard. It doesn't feel as heavy as I was thinking. Now, one reason for that might be I already felt the last 4 Series felt too heavy and too big, and I've always felt that the last M4 was just a little bit of a disappointing car. It just felt too big, and you couldn't really point and shoot it like previous M cars. But this one, I feel like it's not necessarily better than the previous 4 Series, but I don't really think of it as any worse, even though it adds more technology and surely more weight, more heft, more interior room. You would think it would handle worse, but it doesn't really. So it's not as sporty or as spry as you might want for an M4 Series to be, but I don't see any great drawback compared to the last car, and I actually think it handles reasonably well. I have to say, overall, I think this is an excellent car. It is definitely not as spry and exciting and quick to change lanes and directions as old, BMW models from the 90s, the 2000s that a lot of people miss. But truthfully, I think this is great. It drives well, it has good technology, it's nice and comfortable, good interior. There are some areas where all of that stuff could improve. Could be a larger screen, a better gauge cluster screen, some better interior materials, blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, there's a lot of good in here. Even if it's not perfect necessarily, in a lot of ways, it's excellent. I really think this car's biggest drawback is that front end styling, which pretty much ensures you're always going to get people talking to you about, oh, the weird grille, and you have to decide if you really like it. It's such a shame that they took an otherwise great car and kind of gave it that one little reason why people are definitely going to dislike it. I wouldn't be surprised if that grille goes away sooner rather than later. And so that's the new BMW M440i. This is a fun car. It's fast, it's thrilling, it's exciting, but it's also gotten big, and it's definitely a departure from BMW Coupes in the days of the E30 and E36 3 Series models. Still, this car has big performance and big technology and a big grille. And now it's time to give the M440 a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the M440i is such a weird mixed bag. Basically everything behind the front end looks nice, but the front end is so badly done it compromises the whole thing. It gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is in the low 4-second range and it gets a 7 out of 10. Handling, it's fine. It's gotten larger and it's not quite as connected as 3 Series models of years past, but it's good enough and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is a similar story and it gets a 6 out of 10. Cool factor is low. These are less special than they once were back when the 3 Series was king. It gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 29 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The M440i has a lot of great modern tech and it gets an 8 out of 10. Comfort is normal for this segment and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is good with a nice interior and good but not great materials and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, value, and this is surprisingly expensive with a sticker price of over $60,000, but it does deliver good tech and a good interior and nice driving characteristics. Not great in these areas, but fine, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 32 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 61 out of 100, which places the M440i here against relevant cars. It does reasonably well, but frankly, I would rather have the M340i, which is really excellent. The M340i is just as fast, more practical, and better looking. This M440 is an excellent BMW Coupe, but it certainly has lost a little of the appeal of BMW Coupes from years past.